single mother walks into the courtroom, dreading a fine she simply can't afford. But when her 4-year-old daughter suddenly interrupts the proceedings with an innocent remark, the entire courtroom falls silent. Will the notoriously strict judge have a change of heart? Do you think the law should make room for compassion in cases like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's dive into this powerful and emotional story. The courtroom was heavy with silence. The kind of silence that made people shift in their seats, that settled like an unseen weight on the air. Rows of dark mahogany benches stretched out behind the defendant's podium, where a handful of spectators whispered in hushed voices. The towering walls and the gleaming brass nameplate in front of the judge's bench added to the gravity of the moment, making even a minor case feel like a life-altering trial. At the center of it all sat Judge Nathaniel Graves. He was a man of iron principles, a firm believer that the law existed to be upheld, not bent, not softened, not debated. His deep-set eyes, sharp and unreadable, had made many defendants break into nervous stammers before they even spoke. Mercy was not his style. Justice was. When he raised the gavel, the sound that followed was not just a signal, it was a judgment. A declaration that this courtroom was his domain. Next case, the clerk announced. A woman stepped forward, leading a small child by the hand. Elena Carter. She was thin, tired, yet composed. The kind of tired that settled into a person's bones from too many nights of worry. Her clothes, though neat, carried the unmistakable wear of someone who had stretched every dollar for as long as it would go. By her side, a 4-year-old girl, Lily, clung to her mother's coat, eyes wide with quiet curiosity. She was too young to fully understand where they were, but old enough to sense that this place was different. Cold, serious, unwelcoming. Elena kept her head high as she reached the defendant's podium, though the weight of exhaustion tugged at her shoulders. She knew what was coming. The charge? A $200 fine for parking illegally in a handicapped zone. A routine case, one the judge had seen countless times before. But to Elena, it was everything. Elena's heart pounded as she stood before Judge Graves. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't irresponsible. But she also wasn't rich enough to fix a mistake like this with a simple payment. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Your Honor, I understand I parked in the wrong place, but please, let me explain. Judge Graves raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His gaze, cold and impassive, settled on the case file before him. The law is clear, Miss Carter. The handicapped zone is not for convenience. It is not for temporary stops. It is not for emergencies. It is for those who need it. Period. The words landed like a blow, but Elena held her ground. She had no choice that day. Lily had woken up burning with fever, her small body trembling, her forehead slick with sweat. Elena had panicked, grabbing her purse and rushing her to the nearest pharmacy. The parking lot had been full, except for one space. She had hesitated. She knew it was wrong. But Lily was whimpering in the back seat, her tiny voice weak, pleading for help. It'll just be a minute, Elena had told herself, stepping out of the car and running inside. But a minute turned into 5, then 10. By the time she returned, clutching the bottle of children's fever medicine, a bright orange ticket was waiting on her windshield. Now, standing before a man who did not tolerate excuses, she swallowed back her fear. Would he even care? Would he listen? The room was silent, except for the faint scratch of Judge Graves's pen against paper as he flipped through her record. He showed no reaction, no sign of sympathy, no indication that her words meant anything to him. Then, suddenly, a small voice broke the silence. Mommy, I'm hungry. The words were spoken so simply, so innocently, that the entire courtroom stilled. Lily, oblivious to the weight of the moment, tugged at her mother's sleeve, looking up at her expectantly. Can we get something to eat after this? A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Some people chuckled under their breath, others looked at Judge Graves, waiting for his reaction. Elena's face flushed with embarrassment. She bent down quickly, whispering, Sweetheart, not now. You can't talk here, okay? But Lily didn't understand. She tilted her head at her mother, then turned her attention to the judge. Do you have snacks, mister? A stunned silence followed. Even Judge Graves hesitated for the briefest moment. His fingers, which had been idly tapping against the desk, suddenly stopped. His expression, so unreadable before, shifted, if only for a second. He was looking at Lily, but But he wasn't just seeing her. For the first time in years, something cracked in the walls he had built around himself. A memory surfaced, a different child, a little girl with golden curls, a voice just as sweet, just as full of innocence. A child he had lost. The courtroom faded for a moment, replaced by the distant echo of laughter. The sound of tiny feet running through his house. The scent of lavender shampoo in her hair when he kissed her goodnight. Then, the accident. A car crash that had stolen his daughter away forever. He had sworn after that day that emotions had no place in his courtroom. That justice must be blind, because if he allowed himself to feel, he would break. Now, staring into Lily's big, expectant eyes, he felt something shift inside him. Judge Graves cleared his throat, snapping himself back to reality. Miss Carter, step forward. Elena's hands tightened into fists at her sides. This was it. The moment that would decide whether she could afford rent this month, or whether she and Lily would be one step closer to losing everything. The judge stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something no one expected. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and asked, Miss Carter, do you work? Elena blinked. Yes, Your Honor, 2 jobs. Then I assume you know the value of hard work. She nodded. Judge Graves exhaled deeply, his fingers interlacing as he made his decision. The fine stands. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Elena's stomach dropped. Then he continued. However, instead of paying it in cash, you will complete 20 hours of community service at the local women's shelter. If you complete it within 30 days, the fine will be cleared from your record. Another wave of whispers filled the room. Elena blinked in shock. Community service? He was giving her a way out? She swallowed the lump in her throat, barely able to speak. Yes, Your Honor, I'll do it. Judge Graves nodded once, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small slip of paper. And take this. It's a contact for a job training program. If you're willing to work hard, they'll help you find a better paying position. Elena's breath hitched. She stared at the paper in her hand. A second chance. A real chance. She lifted her head, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Judge Graves didn't respond. But as Elena turned to leave, his gaze flickered back to Lily. And for the first time in years, he smiled. Elena took a shaky breath, forcing herself to meet the judge's unyielding gaze. Your Honor, I understand that parking in a handicapped space was wrong, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I never would have done it if I had another choice, but there is always a choice, Miss Carter. Judge Graves' voice was calm but carried the weight of a verdict already decided. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together, his expression unreadable. Elena swallowed hard. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. My daughter was sick, she continued, trying to steady her voice. She had a high fever that morning. I had to get her medicine before I went to work. I parked there because it was the only open space. I told myself it would just be for a minute, but the line was longer than I expected, and when I came back, she didn't need to finish. The orange ticket. The gut-wrenching realization. The fear of how she'd ever pay it. Judge Graves barely reacted. No sympathy, no flicker of understanding. Just the cold calculation of a man who had heard every excuse in the book. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, without even looking up, he spoke. The law does not bend for personal circumstances, Miss Carter. Elena's chest tightened. If we allow exceptions for one person, we must allow them for all. And if we do that, what happens to order? To justice? His voice was firm, absolute, final. The words felt like the slamming of a door. Elena gripped the edge of the podium, her fingernails pressing into the wood. This was it. This was the moment she had dreaded. She had pleaded her case, laid her heart bare. But it didn't matter. She had already lost. Then, a small voice broke through the silence. A tiny voice, soft but clear, cut through the heavy silence like a pin dropping in a crowded room. Mommy, I'm hungry. Do they sell cookies here? The words were innocent, unassuming. But in the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom, they landed like a thunderclap. A hush fell over the room. The bailiff's pen, which had been idly tapping against his clipboard, froze mid-motion. The court clerk glanced up from her papers, eyebrows raised in surprise. A few of the spectators shifted, exchanging glances, unsure whether to be amused or horrified. A child interrupting a courtroom proceeding. Elena's face burned with embarrassment. She instinctively reached down, gently pulling Lily closer to her side, whispering urgently, "Sweetheart, not now. You can't talk in court, okay?" But Lily, still too young to grasp the weight of the moment, simply blinked up at her mother with innocent confusion. And then, Judge Graves moved. Not much. Just the smallest tilt of his head, his eyes shifting away from the case file in front of him for the first time since the hearing had begun. He was looking at Lily, and for a brief, fleeting moment, something changed in his gaze. For a moment, Judge Graves remained silent. The weight of his authority, once so firmly in his grasp, felt momentarily unsteady. He had heard countless pleas, seen desperate faces hoping for mercy. None of them had ever unsettled him. But now his gaze was locked on the smallest person in the room. Slowly, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench. His sharp eyes, always so distant, narrowed slightly. His voice, though still firm, had lost some of its usual sharpness. "Are you hungry, little one?" Lily's small fingers curled into the fabric of her mother's coat. She hesitated, glancing up at Elena as if seeking permission to answer. Elena barely breathed. The entire courtroom was still. Then, with childlike honesty, Lily nodded. "Mommy said we didn't have enough money for breakfast today," she said, her voice light, untroubled, as if she were merely stating a fact. "But it's okay. She told me if I'm good, everything will be fine." The words landed like a shockwave. The courtroom, once filled with quiet murmurs and the occasional shuffling of papers, had gone completely still. A woman in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff, who had remained indifferent through countless cases, exhaled quietly, his expression unreadable. Even the court clerk, always professional and detached, averted her gaze, suddenly aware of an invisible tension in the room. But the most striking reaction came from Judge Graves himself. For the briefest moment, he hesitated. His fingers, once interlocked in front of him, curled slightly against the polished wood of his desk. Not much, just enough. His jaw tightened. His breath, barely perceptible, slowed, and then his eyes flickered. Not much, just a flash of something buried deep. A different memory. Laughter, light and free, echoing down a hallway. Tiny hands gripping his fingers, golden curls bouncing as she ran, the scent of lavender shampoo. And then, the silence that followed, the unbearable, permanent silence. He swallowed, forcing the memory back into the recesses of his mind. Control. Discipline. That was what had kept him strong all these years. He straightened his posture, exhaling quietly as he forced himself back into the present. The courtroom was watching. He could not afford to waver. With slow, deliberate precision, Judge Graves steeled his expression once more. His voice, when he finally spoke, was level, but not quite as cold as before. "The court does not deal in sentiment, Miss Carter." But for the first time in years, he was not so sure. A cough broke the silence. Then a chair scraped against the floor. And suddenly, the stillness shattered. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, an undercurrent of whispers swelling just beneath the surface. The weight of Lily's innocent words still hung in the air, but now the atmosphere had shifted. People exchanged uncertain glances. Some sat stiffly, arms crossed, unwilling to let emotion cloud their judgment. Others shifted in their seats, their faces softer, brows furrowed as they stole glances at Elena and her daughter. At the bench, Judge Graves had yet to move. His hands remained folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. But the way his fingers subtly curled against the desk, the slow exhale through his nose, there was something there. A hesitation. A moment of uncertainty that did not belong in his courtroom. That was when the interruption came. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate." The voice was sharp, cutting through the whispers like a blade. Richard Vaughn, the lead prosecutor, known for his unyielding nature, pushed back from his table with deliberate force. His posture was straight, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression unwavering. A man who saw the law in black and white, and nothing in between. He turned briefly toward Elena, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience, before locking his gaze on the judge. "This courtroom is not a place for personal appeals or emotional outbursts," Vaughn stated, his voice firm. "With all due respect, Your Honor, if we start excusing violations based on personal hardship, where does it end? Today it's this woman, tomorrow it's 100 more. The law must be applied equally to all." A ripple of reaction followed. Some in the audience nodded in agreement, their expressions set in stone. They understood hardship, but rules were rules. If everyone bent them, then what was the point? Yet others, especially the parents in the room, looked uneasy. A woman near the back, holding a toddler on her lap, shook her head slightly. She leaned in toward the man beside her and whispered, "But she's just a mother trying to take care of her child." Another man, arms crossed, scoffed. "If she gets away with it, then what's stopping everyone else?" The divide in the room was unmistakable. Justice or mercy, law or compassion, and at the center of it all, Judge Graves. He hadn't spoken, hadn't reacted. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. His gaze flickered toward Lily again, just for a second. Just long enough to know that something about this case was no longer as simple as it should have been. And then, as if snapping back to reality, he drew in a slow breath, stealing his expression once more. His voice, when it came, was steady. Enough. The courtroom fell silent once again. Judge Graves straightened, his fingers resting flat against the desk now. His eyes were sharp once more, fixed on the prosecutor. "Mr. Vaughn, the court will determine what is and is not appropriate." The words were spoken with authority, firm yet controlled. For the first time, Vaughn hesitated. And in that hesitation, something unspoken passed through the room. The battle was not just about Elena anymore. It was about something deeper, something personal. Something Judge Graves had not yet spoken aloud. The courtroom was still. Too still. Judge Graves could feel it, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. Vaughn's words had created a clear divide, and now the air hung heavy with expectation. But Graves wasn't looking at Vaughn anymore. His gaze had drifted downward to the smallest person in the room. Lily. She still held tightly onto her mother's coat, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric as if it were the only thing anchoring her in this unfamiliar place. Her wide eyes, filled with quiet curiosity, flickered between the adults around her, unaware of the gravity of the moment. Graves shouldn't have cared. He shouldn't have hesitated. This was a courtroom, not a place for sentiment. And yet, something made him break his own rule. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His deep voice, always controlled, came softer this time. "Do you know why your mother is here, young lady?" A murmur rippled through the room. A question, not a verdict, not a ruling. A question directed at a child. Helena stiffened. She hadn't expected this. Neither had Vaughn, who shot the judge a sharp look as if trying to gauge what exactly he was doing. Lily blinked up at him, tilting her head as if he had just asked her a riddle she wasn't sure she had the answer to. She hesitated. Then, with the quiet confidence of a child who had never been taught to fear authority, she replied, "Mommy said she did something wrong." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying in the silence of the courtroom. Graves nodded slightly. "And do you know what that means?" Lily frowned, thinking. Then, after a pause, she shook her head. "Not really." Graves should have ended it there. Should have moved on. Should have dismissed the case, delivered the sentence, and let the law stand as it always had. But instead, he found himself asking one more question. "Then tell me this." His voice remained measured, but there was something else in it now, something quieter, heavier. "Do you think your mother is a bad person?" Lily furrowed her brows, confusion flickering across her face. But she hesitated, then looked straight into his eyes. "If my mommy is a bad person, why does she always make sweet bread for me and hug me when I'm sad?" Silence. Utter, complete silence. The weight of her words settled over the courtroom like a thick blanket. A woman in the back row let out a quiet breath, barely audible but somehow deafening in the stillness. A man near the aisle shifted, rubbing the back of his neck, suddenly uncomfortable. Even Vaughn, always quick to counter, had no immediate rebuttal. And Judge Graves? For the first time in years, he had no immediate response either. His fingers, once neatly interlocked, curled slightly against the wood of the bench. His jaw tightened, a flicker of something deep, something buried, passed through his eyes. And just like that, the trial was no longer about a parking violation. It was about something far greater. Something he was no longer sure he could ignore. Judge Graves had spent years mastering the art of detachment. The courtroom was his domain, a place of law and order, where emotions had no place, where justice was measured in facts, not feelings. He had presided over hundreds of cases, listened to countless excuses, and handed down sentences with a firm, unwavering hand. But now, as he looked into the wide, earnest eyes of the little girl before him, Something inside him shifted. Lily's words still lingered in the air. If my mommy is a bad person, why does she always make sweet bread for me and hug me when I'm sad? It was an innocent question. A child's logic, simple, unfiltered. But for Graves, it was more than that. For the first time in what felt like forever, he saw a different face staring back at him. Not Lily. Amelia. His breath caught in his throat, though his face betrayed nothing. He hadn't spoken her name in years, hadn't allowed himself to. But suddenly, she was there. A little girl with golden curls bouncing as she ran. A giggle that used to fill the walls of his home. Tiny fingers gripping his own, tugging him toward something. A book, a doll, a silly drawing she had made just for him. Look, Daddy, do you like it? He always had. But the memory didn't stop there, because memories never did. The laughter faded, the brightness dimmed, and then the silence. A phone call in the middle of the night, the feeling of his knees hitting the hospital floor, the cold, sterile scent of antiseptic and heartbreak. His little girl, gone. A car crash. A senseless, cruel twist of fate that had taken the one thing he could never get back. The grief had been unbearable, so he buried it. He built walls, around his heart, around his mind, around his courtroom. The law became his refuge, his armor. If he followed the rules, if he focused only on justice, maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't feel the loss so deeply. And for years it had worked. Until now. Until a 4-year-old girl, innocent and unknowing, had cracked the walls he had so carefully built. For the first time in years, Judge Nathaniel Graves wasn't sure if the law alone was enough. Judge Graves sat motionless, his fingers resting on the edges of Elena's case file. The weight of the room pressed down on him, but he did not let it show. Slowly, methodically, he flipped through the pages. Her record was clean. No prior offenses, no history of evading the law. A single mother, 2 jobs, barely scraping by. Everything in the file painted the picture of a woman who wasn't reckless, who wasn't indifferent to the rules. She was simply trying to survive. His eyes lingered on the details, her employment history, the hours logged at a local diner and a bakery, late shifts, early mornings, and now a $200 fine that could mean the difference between keeping the lights on or not. A single mistake. That was all it had taken for her to end up here. Graves exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. He had seen this before, too many times. People who weren't criminals, who weren't threats to society, yet found themselves crushed beneath the weight of an unyielding system. But then, the other voice in his head spoke. The law is the law. Compassion is not justice. He had spent years ensuring that personal feelings never clouded his judgment. The moment you start bending the rules cease to mean anything at all. His grip on the file tightened. If he let emotion dictate his rulings, where would it stop? If he made an exception today, how could he justify denying one tomorrow? A judge's duty was to uphold the law, not to rewrite it. And yet, his eyes flickered toward Lily, still clutching her mother's coat, her innocent gaze watching him without judgment, without expectation. And somewhere beneath the weight of the robe he had worn for so many years, Nathaniel Graves felt human again. His fingers hovered over the case file. The courtroom was waiting. He had to decide, and for the first time in a long, long time, he did not know what to do. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Judge Graves exhaled slowly, his fingers still resting on the file in front of him. The weight of the decision pressed heavy on his chest, but he knew there was no escaping it now. With measured intent, he pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Every eye was locked on him. Every breath held. Elena straightened her spine, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She was bracing herself. Lily, sensing something but not understanding what, gripped her mother's hand tighter. Then, in a voice that carried the full weight of the law, Judge Graves spoke. Elena Carter, I will not dismiss your case. A murmur ran through the gallery. Elena's face paled. Her shoulders stiffened as if she had just been struck. Lily's small fingers curled around her mother's hand, clinging to the only sense of safety she knew. For a second, just a second, Graves thought he saw something flicker in Elena's eyes. Defeat. The kind that came from someone who had spent their whole life fighting, only to realize that no matter how hard they tried, it was never enough. The kind of defeat that Amelia's mother had carried after the accident. His chest tightened, and then he continued. I am going to give you another option. The murmurs stopped. The room froze. Even Vaughn, who had looked so certain of the outcome just moments ago, furrowed his brows, his mouth parting slightly, surprised. Elena's lips parted, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Hope was a fragile thing, and right now, she didn't know whether to believe in it. A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Graves let his words settle, allowing the weight of them to take hold. The tension that had gripped the air only moments ago now shifted. Not gone, but different. Elena blinked, her breath catching in her throat. Had she heard him correctly? From the prosecutor's table, Vaughn stiffened, his jaw clenched slightly, but he said nothing, perhaps sensing that this was no longer an argument he could win. Judge Graves looked directly at Elena, his expression unreadable. Instead of paying the fine, you will complete 20 hours of community service at the women's shelter downtown. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Elena's lips parted slightly in shock. If you complete your hours in full, the judge continued, your case will be dismissed, and no record of this violation will remain. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then Elena exhaled sharply, a sound that was half disbelief, half relief. Lily, sensing the shift in her mother, looked up at her and whispered, "Mommy, does that mean we don't have to pay?" Elena swallowed hard, nodding slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, baby." A murmur of conversation spread through the courtroom, not of outrage, but of intrigue. This was not the ruling anyone had expected, but somehow it felt right. The courtroom slowly began to empty, the hum of conversation fading into the background as people filtered out, still murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Elena remained frozen in place, still trying to absorb what had just happened. She had walked in that morning expecting to leave more broken than she already was. Instead, she had been given something she hadn't dared to hope for. A chance. She felt Lily tug gently on her sleeve, breaking her from her thoughts. "Come on, Mommy," Lily whispered. "Can we go home now?" Elena forced a small smile, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetheart, let's go." She turned toward the door, but before she could take a step, "Miss Carter." The deep, steady voice stopped her in her tracks. She turned back slowly. Judge Graves was watching her. His expression remained firm, but something in his eyes had softened. Elena hesitated, glancing around, unsure if she had done something wrong. But when the judge gestured for her to step closer, she obeyed, approaching the bench cautiously. Graves reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. Without a word, he held it out to her. Elena stared for a moment before slowly reaching up and taking it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. A list. Organizations, resources, places she could go for help. At the bottom, one line stood out. Local Workforce Development Center. Vocational Training and Employment Assistance. Her eyes widened as Graves spoke, his voice quieter this time. "I contacted them this morning," he said simply. "They have programs for single mothers looking for steady work. If you're interested, they'll help you train for something better, something stable." Elena's vision blurred. She had no words. For so long, she had carried everything alone, believing no one saw her struggle, that no one cared. And yet, here it was, a lifeline. Her fingers tightened around the paper as the first tear slipped down her cheek, a real chance at something better. She swallowed hard, struggling to speak past the lump in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you." Graves simply nodded. "Then don't." His voice was gruff, but not unkind. "Just do something with it." Elena nodded fiercely, pressing the paper to her chest as if she could hold on to the hope it carried. She had been given an opportunity. And she wasn't going to waste it. Elena wiped the lingering tears from her cheeks, gripping the paper Judge Graves had given her as if it were a lifeline. She had never expected kindness in a place like this. She turned to go, ready to take her daughter's hand and finally leave behind the weight of this courtroom. But before she could, Lily slipped from her grasp. The little girl turned back toward the judge, her tiny steps deliberate, her gaze locked onto him with the same innocent sincerity that had silenced the entire room earlier. The courtroom, still half filled with lingering spectators, watched in stunned silence. And then, Lily did something no one could have predicted. She took a step forward, wrapped her small arms around Judge Graves' leg, and hugged him. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The bailiff took a startled step forward, unsure whether he should intervene. The clerk covered her mouth, eyes wide. Vaughn shifted uncomfortably, clearly thrown off by the sheer absurdity of it all. But Lily, oblivious to the weight of her actions, simply smiled up at the towering figure above her. "Thank you, mister," she chirped. "When I grow up, I'll make you cookies." For a moment, just a moment, Judge Graves didn't move, didn't react. It had been so long since anyone had touched him like this, since a child's arms had wrapped around him, without fear, without expectation, just pure, unfiltered gratitude. And then for the first time in years, Judge Graves smiled, not the polite, practiced expression he had worn for official appearances, not the cold smirk of formality, a real, genuine smile. Soft, warm, human. The tension that had loomed over the courtroom like a storm finally broke. Laughter, light, genuine laughter, bubbled through the room, rolling like an unexpected wave. The bailiff let out a quiet chuckle. The clerk, still covering her mouth, let out a breathless laugh. Even the spectators, people who had come expecting another rigid sentencing, found themselves smiling. Vaughn, still stiff beside the prosecution table, exhaled sharply and shook his head. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "that's a first." Elena, still stunned, stepped forward and gently pulled Lily back to her side. Her daughter had done what no argument, no plea, no case had ever done before. She had made Judge Nathaniel Graves feel. Still smiling, just barely but undeniably, he gave Lily a single measured nod. "I'll hold you to that, young lady." And with that, the case, and something far greater than that, was finally closed. The case was over. The tension that had once suffocated the room had lifted, replaced by something lighter, something unspoken but deeply felt. Elena, still holding tightly to Lily's hand, turned toward the exit. The heavy wooden doors stood before them, a threshold between the life they had known and the life they now had a chance to rebuild. But just as she reached the doorway, she stopped. Something inside her, maybe instinct, maybe gratitude, made her turn back. Judge Graves was still at the bench, gathering his papers, his expression once again composed. But he was different now. The rigid, unyielding man she had faced at the beginning of the hearing was not the same man sitting before her now. Elena hesitated, then bowed her head, just slightly but deeply enough for him to understand. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said softly. Graves paused, lifting his eyes to meet hers. For a brief moment there was silence. Then he spoke. Not in the firm, detached tone of a judge handing down a ruling. Not in the rehearsed authority of a man who had spent decades keeping emotions at bay, but in the voice of someone who had seen loss, had known grief, and had just begun to remember what it meant to care. "Do the right thing," he said, his words steady but quiet, "for your daughter." Elena's breath caught. She understood. This wasn't just about a parking ticket. It never had been. It was about choices, about breaking cycles, about building something better, not just for herself, but for the little girl whose hand she held so tightly. Lily, still oblivious to the weight of what had just passed between them, gave the judge one last cheerful wave. Then, with a final nod, Elena turned and walked out of the courthouse, toward something new. As the doors swung shut behind them, Judge Nathaniel Graves exhaled slowly. For years he had ruled with a heart hardened by loss, believing justice could only exist in absolutes. But today, a mother, a daughter, and a simple, innocent question had changed something in him. Perhaps justice wasn't just about laws. Perhaps it was about understanding when to uphold them and when to show mercy. And perhaps, just perhaps, his daughter would have been proud. With that thought, Judge Graves closed the case file and for the first time in years, felt lighter. The gavel had fallen. But for everyone in that courtroom, something far greater had been set into motion. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs a little reminder that kindness and second chances still exist. And if you want to hear more powerful, thought-provoking stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world to us. It helps us continue creating meaningful content that inspires, moves, and connects us all. What do you think? Should justice always be strict, or should compassion have a place in the courtroom? Let us know in the comments below. Bookmark Go Back. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.